Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Transformed with AI with Pluto 7, where we uncover the real world effects and transformational changes brought about by AI, machine learning, and cloud technologies in today's supply chain world. My name is Manju Devadas. I'm the founder CEO of Pluto 7. And today we have a very special guest speaker, Mr. Padman Ramankutty, to share with us his experience and predictions for the future of SAP technologies in supply chain world, as well as how they evolve with cloud and AI. For the audience, I've known Padman for a long time, and he's been a supply chain maven who has done hands-on implementation in SAP enterprise ecosystems. He was involved in the early adoption and evolution of Nike's supply chain design, as well as many other large enterprises in CPG world, such as Blue Diamond, as well as in the high-tech world, such as NVIDIA, to name a few. In this conversation, I look forward to having practical, open conversation on not just how things have evolved and technology has been adopted over the last few decades, but how does he see the new technologies getting adopted and what's the advice he can give to.
Thank you for the opportunity to meet with you as well as the audience who are supply chain experts. I have had the privilege of being part of a supply chain development organization at SAP, where we helped develop the APO environment and deployed it in many customers around the world, helped build the organization, and over the years was one of the early adopters of IBP when SAP launched the product in 2012. So we uh, became part of that team that took the product from SAP to market as a first launch partner, and over the years helped deploy IBP in a practical sense across many, many companies, big and small, ranging from Blue Diamond to Schlumberger to Corning and NVIDIA as well. So, relatively comfortable in the SAP world, having lived in there for more than 2 decades. And I'm looking forward to having this conversation and exploring ideas of where we are going to take, where we see the product mature from SAP, as well as where we see the supply chains evolve as we have to consume more data and more fragmentation of the demand and supply. So, thank you for giving me this opportunity. I look forward to the question.
Thank you for the introduction. To start things off, SAP centric supply chains are becoming mainstream or have become a mainstream already for good reasons. Yet, there is a need for additional data to make relevant supply chain decisions. Let us take demand forecasting. So, Padman, when you think about demand forecasting and demand management, how do you see it changing from what you see from a technology perspective or beyond?
So, thanks, Manju. This is a very relevant question. Practically, we can understand what demand forecasting is. Everybody who starts in supply chain jumps in and says, I want to aggregate demand, get demand forecasting up, the accuracy up. The challenge today is run of the mill demand planning that we used to do, time series driven, look at historical data, plot a forward future forecast, remove the outliers. That was all practical and it was all done within the walls of the enterprise, not walls of the distribution center, but walls of the enterprise along the network. The challenge today is that enterprise wall is not constrained by the way the consumer or the buyer is behaving. Buyer today can behave multiple different ways. They can place an order on your practical distribution center or place an order at a retail consumption point or place an order for a direct from factory delivery. But today, the buyer has become the individual. The individual can place an order on the brand and have it picked up at the local distribution center or a local asset place or delivered directly to the home. So, all of this in demand planning, when we used to create the hierarchies and calculate demand at a node, meaning node in the sense of a regional distribution center, this is not, we cannot live in this aggregate. The demand itself is getting so fine granuled that you'll have to practically think about how do I handle so much data? How do I handle the level of detail and granularity of that data within the time bucket so that I don't overstate demand and I am actually picking it up at the individual level and aggregating. So, as we move forward in the future, demand forecasting, as we knew before, which is all about a macro level, product or product group level, at a location within a time bucket, is going to get much more granularized, and that is going to give us better insight so that we don't overproduce, or at the same time we are able to meet the accuracy levels of the company. So that's one of the big challenges that we see in the future of demand forecasting. What it entails is bigger amounts of data that is not relevant in the ERP system, data that is external to this, external to the enterprise data schemas, but definitely needed to understand the variation and the movement of demand and spreading of the demand across the user community. So that to me is what is going to change. That individual behavior is going to drive a new set of supply chain evolution just in demand. I'm, it's going to spread across supply, production, deployment. All of these areas are going to be affected. But demand by itself is actually showing you this level of spreading of detail data that we have to now aggregate or bring into our demand planning process. So that to me is the biggest challenge.
Padman, thanks for articulating that. As we work with, as Pluto 7, as we work with large enterprises alongside our partners like Google and many others, we resonate with what you just said, and especially with the experience that you bring in, having dealt with these large enterprises. They have implemented systems over a period of time, and they own many technologies just to solve the one problem that you mentioned, which is demand forecasting.
Mhm.
And to your point, when we talk about the fine grained granularity at which the enterprises want now to forecast at a given node, like you mentioned, when the customer behavior, which is the other point that you mentioned, when that behavior is changing, the expectation of customer is changing, and they are changing the demand for you at a much shorter window. Now, the need to have a corresponding fine grained demand forecasting capability is becoming essential. We are seeing this in many enterprises where not only do they want to have this fine grained demand forecasting, but also forecast change more frequently based on the change in the physical world. The third point that you mentioned, which is becoming more and more important, is it is the demand is a reflection of what's happening with the customer, your world in general, and then of course what's happening within your enterprise. The third point that you mentioned is you need to bring in data from the whole ecosystem, because that everything affects the demand. And as we do this, right, we continue to work with customers to set up the data foundation so that they can first bring the data in one place. And then the other challenge that we hear, Padman, is these scenarios that are changing and affecting them, whether it's COVID or a war or the customer uh, buying patterns change, one because they have either too much money in one area or less money, and then that has an impact to supply. What's your thought on that, and how? And you did mention about it's not just about demand. This will what you just explained goes across supply as well. Help us understand how do you see all of these things further evolve with using the cloud and AI technologies.
Very, very valid. Um, Thanks for the question, because this is absolutely. I'm reminded of a company that we were implementing, IBP, and this company was selling a um, paint, and they had a very defined channel. They sold through 2,000 big box stores. They were a private label behavior to that company directly. But the brand, the, the brand and the retail outlet had a symbiotic relationship. So the company decided, hey, I need to now tap the 2,000 stores, have 100 plus contractors, and these contractors now need to be my customers. The store itself is not the customer. I want to sell to the contractor and deliver them the paint at their location level, at this job site, so that they can consume this level of detail. The challenge now, suddenly, these contractors are not in the enterprise environment of the box store. The contractors pick up the paint at the box store and get it delivered and paint at the job site. Now the paint manufacturer, the brand itself decided, why not sell it to the do-it-yourself, 2 million do-it-yourself people in this country who paint their own houses, and they want unique colors and unique shades. So we'll create a algorithm or a configurator type of thing to enforce and give them this idea of new products, new colors that they can buy. So in one half of a year, they changed the business model in demand planning, which was stable for 30 years, selling to big box, into three different categories of 200,000 contractors and 2 million consumers, both new set of people. All of a sudden, our forecasting model had to change. So when we had to create this, you had no historical information about how the individual do-it-yourself painter will buy, what colors they will buy, and you did not have information on the contractor in the enterprise system. So we had to bring this data into the planning engine. But before we bring it into the planning engine, you need to have a persistence layer, because this data is floating in the marketplace, and we are buying this marketplace data and looking at this data to help us evaluate the forecasting. So um, when you really look at it, in this practical example, you will need to bring in data from external systems, external environments, ecosystems, not technical architecture. So it's weather. So if you're selling to contractors paint, you need to calculate how much paint, whether the weather in New York is ready for do it yourself, if that is where you're going to ship the paint. So all of this data, external data, have an impact on the supply chain. And if you look at on the supply side, there is a practical requirement about looking at synchronicity between the demand and the supply. If demand is fluctuating fast enough, I want to be able to switch my supply requirements quite fast. And today, because the enterprise systems are spread across, we cannot seem to indicate real change at the supply chain level, supply planning level. So That's one example that came to mind on that question.
Thanks, Padman, for laying out that paint company example. We could relate to many of the aspects that you mentioned. What I heard is three different key elements here. First is the change in the business model on whom they're selling to, and what's the behavioral change because of that. Second is the change in the supply chain network design because of that. And the third is the implication to demand forecasting, and of course, the related system and data dependency. And within that system and data dependency, what you had to battle with is not only was this data very internal focused, the need for external data to truly get the right demand signals and demand forecast became essential. And how that one example that you took on demand forecasting mattered to make sure that the business outcomes were achieved with the change in the business model. And when you think about these, Padman, and what we do for our customers are asking for all of what you just said. Because of COVID, or because of war, or because of too much treasury money out in the market, and all this, there is more money out in the market, but there's not enough supply. There is container problems, there is shipping problem, there is supplier problem that's affecting the demand and supply. At the same time, customers want to transform while they're dealing with all this. And the transformation, whether, like you mentioned, redesigning the supply chain network, even rethinking the business model to some extent because of the customer's behavioral changes, and then rethinking their system architectures, whether it's evolution with a cloud or a hybrid cloud, evolution with AI, they're bringing all to the table now. At the same time, they would like to have faster results in terms of driving forecast accuracy by bringing these technology. From your experience, Padman, how or what would you advise to companies on how to get on a successful journey, considering not just the experience that you bring from the past, but on your vision to the future? Because as you know, history repeats itself. Companies and people make the same mistakes what they have done in the past. What's your advice for them to make lesser mistakes?
So when COVID impacted the supply chain, there were a couple of interesting challenges. Some of the customers I had worked with saw their demand shoot up exponentially, and they couldn't get the product out fast enough. But they were geared for large bulk orders, not for the individual SKU order, which is where everybody was trying to get individual toilet papers or wipes and things like that. But the product was manufactured in bulk and sold in bulk to big box retailers or into individual SKUs at a retail shop, but there was no way to break bulk and create. So scenario planning became a big challenge during that time. The way we addressed scenario planning was we kept taking the same old models that we had done on SAP or any other practical systems, advanced planning system, and ran some scenarios out of it. What if demand shifted? What if demand went up? What if demand disappeared? Can we position it into different parts of the network? And we had a very successful delivery of that for some of the biggest brands in the world. We did optimization, we did challenging environments, trade off environments we looked at. So, when you really look at scenario planning today, I think the more data we get in to a supply planning system or be it demand forecasting, or practically a lot of the consumers or a lot of the enterprise users who themselves have changed behavior are now looking to create interesting solution sets and variations on the solution to say, is it practical to ship from a third party? One of the best examples for me was My customer, Blue Diamond, was making nuts, and during COVID, their amount of milk products, wet products they were making went down, and the number of amount of snack products that people wanted when demand soared. So all of a sudden, you had this interesting challenge, and we didn't have capacity. They didn't have capacity, so we reconfigured their planning environment in a less than 30 days to add a subcon third party packing outfit for increasing capacity on the snacks, reduce their environment, and then change their weekly planning of truck delivery and pickup to daily planning. And that was done in a rapid fire model. So I think the practical challenge today, looking forward, because new types of business models are emerging every day, be it in a restaurant industry with delivery, in dine and takeout, or be it in a Blue Diamond where on demand subcon co-packing plant had to be brought up. Um, this type of business model change is going to become pretty constant, um, because we as consumers are demanding convenience, practicality, and we are changing our behavior, which is reflecting on these big planning systems. So, network, business model, uh, tools, and the data needed to calculate the supply chain uh, levels of inventory or levels of supply is all changing.
Two, one. So, Padman, that was a very interesting example that you quoted. Pluto 7 having been with hundreds of customers during COVID and their supply chain getting disrupted, we ourselves observed many such need for rapid scenario planning. What we heard from you is three things, right? One is scenarios are going to change, and you need to be ready to make and reconfigure your capabilities to adapt to the scenarios. Second is when you reconfigure the capabilities for the scenario change, you need to be able to do it with a shorter window, not take months because it's happening now. And the third is the need for flexibility. And I'm going to go kind of build upon the flexibility. And this is where, when we started off this conversation, which is the need for the cloud and AI platforms, becomes a necessity when companies are thinking, and even when you look at legacy companies, you have seen that many in your experience over last decades, decade plus in my experience, companies buy SAP and a whole bunch of supply chain softwares to even solve one problem like demand forecasting. And then on the other extreme, they have Excel, right? So they use both these tools to achieve their outcome, and still it's not good enough. That's because of many of the things that you mentioned. They have scenarios that they want to plan. They can't go reconfigure every day. They take it to the Excel. And that alone is not good enough because it's standalone. You need to coexist with all the other things happening in your SAP. Now, customers are now caught between the two, right? And now they want a data foundation or AI capability. Not only can they bring data from SAP, for example, through the Google Cortex framework into Google Cloud, but also be able to plan rapidly, not just in Excels, which they will probably, for a long time, but they want a better alternative to Excel as well, so that in a centralized data set, whether it's a Google Sheet or in a connected way, they can at least be working on a common collaborative platform to do this scenario planning. While they're doing that, they don't want to keep doing this, running the scenario planning on by their own and in their head. They want those scenario plans to be automated through simple machine learning models so that they're getting recommendations and predictions. Now, as you see all of this, Padman, these are some of the things that we are seeing. What do you see as the future over the next 5 years and 10 years? And what's your advice as a conclusion to this conversation to those enterprises who have to also look beyond technology in the form of people and change management?
Mhm. So, couple of things granted in the future. In the future, whatever systems of intelligence, systems of record, systems of differentiation, whatever layer you are in the enterprise, you have to think it is comes embedded with ML and AI capabilities. It is also fair to conclude that extra data sets, both from external systems and internally generated data sets, need to be accommodated in the larger schemas to in order to understand the supply chain a lot better. So, for example, in most companies, we are so good at calculating demand, supply, deployment, ATP, all of this. We measure it, we calculate all of the OTIF numbers, the metric, and then we hand it over to a third party shipping company or an LSP who has a time window of 8 weeks to get it from China to the West Coast, where we have absolutely no control or no view of how to calculate, how to track it, or see the quantity and any of those things. So we go from highly granular, decisive, deterministic detail to an abstracted window of opportunity. And then we try to layer software to predict where this will go. I think more interesting would be in the future how we look at hybridized supply chain, which means the supply chain is not a single long linear thread to China or Vietnam or Indonesia. The supply chain is a network with sometimes the product coming out of the Midwest or the East Coast or the South or Mexico or Canada, but also coming out of China and Vietnam. So it's going to become more complex. What that means is behavioral changes, change management, expecting the employee to just take what you throw at them is not going to be helpful. You have to introduce change in a practical way, teach, coach how these decisions are made in order for companies to execute better. So practically, um, the the models are going to get complex. The supply chain is going to get complex because you'll have built-in resiliency, which is an increase in inventory, maybe an increase in capacity. You'll have built-in hybrid models, which is I may have a local for local or a local production facility and a external facility that is swappable. So there could be all these complexities being brought, and yet we don't train the people and teach the people and practically create the change aspect of it. That is where a lot of companies may fail. It's not the technology that they are deploying, it is adapting to the technology.
Thanks, Padman. That was very insightful. The last comment, especially, is worth a lot of money that you save for enterprises, especially with change management. It's not about just introducing a technology, it is making sure that the technology is adopted and used well by enterprises. Now, few takeaways I got out of the conversation is in the last section, it was around supply chains are going to get complex because of the point you made earlier.
Yeah.
Customer expectation is changing, enterprises are changing. So you need to be able to adapt to the change in the supply chain network designs as well as supply chains itself. So for that, data is a way to stay connected to your physical world. So you need a foundation system or capabilities which will continuously evolve as you have to bring in more internal and external data, even just for your forecasting. And the same foundation then expands to your supply, and then you mentioned about transportation and many of those other necessities. As you think about the third point that I could correlate what you mentioned is these intelligent systems that you bring in, call it a digital twin or a control tower, these are systems that will evolve with the needs of the market. And you have to be ready to not only introduce the change to the people, but also train them to use these capabilities and evolve with it. It's not going to be a simple make or a build decision. It's going to be something in between. So the last point, Padman, is when we looked at Pluto 7 in terms of how we serve our customers, we worked with hundreds of customers from supply chain improvements, from decision intelligence, or even factory automation. And when we started converging and relating to what you just said, it all came down to better data foundation capabilities, better AI capabilities to be able to automate or semi-automate decisions. And that's where we designed our planning in a box solution. With that, Padman, it's been an honor working with you and listening to your thoughts, which is, I'm sure our advisor, our audience found a lot of nuggets that they can take and apply to their own business. For the audience who want to connect and hear more from Padman, please feel free to connect with him on his LinkedIn, Padman Ramankutty, and as well as check out our website, pluto7.com. Thank you, Padman.
Thank you, Manju. Enjoyed the conversation, and I'm looking forward to finding new ideas and new practical models to make supply chains relevant and more easy to consume for our customers. Look forward to working with you as we traverse this journey in supply chain. Thanks.
So, Padman, more than ever before, the industry needs visionaries like you. What we are seeing now is once in 100-year occurrence. I'm sure you would agree with that.
Absolutely. 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 It's very good.
Thank you.
Thank you.